The chamber is open, and the air tastes like old stone and older fear. Somewhere beneath Hogwarts, something ancient breathes through cracks in the world. It doesn't speak in words, not really. It speaks in pressure, in a crawling sensation along your skin, in the sense that the castle is listening, and that makes this question feel less like a theory and more like a confession. What if Hermione Granger was never a mystery of Muggle-born brilliance? What if she was never an accident of magic that no one could explain? What if she was blood, old blood, hidden so completely the wizarding world forgot to look? What if she was Sirius Black's daughter, not adopted in sentiment, not chosen family after the fact? His blood, his line, his secret. A thread pulled tight under history, waiting for the moment it could snap. 1978. Youth ends at the edge of war. Sirius Black graduated in June 1978, at 18 years old, and he did not leave Hogwarts like most students left it. Most students stepped out of the castle and into a future. Sirius stepped out into a battlefield that had already been burning for years. He was tall, beautiful in a way that made people angry, with that aristocratic sharpness the Black family carved into their children, as if bone structure was a creed. He wore his rebellion like a second set of robes, laughing too loudly, moving too quickly. Acting like rules were suggestions because the alternative was admitting the world could be cruel enough to break him. He had a reckless streak that felt like freedom in a time when freedom was getting rarer by the week. Because the First Wizarding War was not cinematic. It was not clean. It was a war of rooms and alleyways and missing people. It was a war where you stopped planning long-term because long-term was a luxury. You planned in days. You planned in hours. You planned in the space between meetings, where you wondered who wouldn't show up next time. The Order of the Phoenix was fighting a shadow war where survival was measured in weeks rather than years. People died in patterns, like a drumbeat that never got tired. Fabian and Gideon Prewett would fall in 1981, taking 5 Death Eaters with them. Dorcas Meadows would be murdered by Voldemort personally. The Bones family would be nearly erased. Marlene McKinnon would be slaughtered with her entire family in mid-1981, as a message carved into flesh. But in the autumn of 1978, Marlene McKinnon was alive. She was 22, a member of the Order, and already carrying the kind of exhaustion you only earn when you've watched too many friends vanish into funeral smoke. She fought beside James and Lily Potter. She fought beside Remus Lupin. And she fought beside Sirius Black. And the truth is, when people fight beside each other long enough, they stop being just names in a meeting room. They become gravity. They become the only warmth that isn't poisoned. The suspicious silence in the canon. In the canon, we know Sirius has no romantic history. No girlfriend. No lover. No whispered relationship. Not a single mention in 7 books that he ever held anyone the way people hold each other when the world is trying to kill them. For a charismatic young man in the most intense period of his life, surrounded by a tight-knit group of fighters who trusted each other with their lives, that absence is strange. In this timeline, the reason is not complicated. It was secret because it had to be. Sirius and Marlene weren't writing love letters. They weren't building forever. They were building small, stolen moments, because forever did not feel promised to anyone. It wasn't a grand romance. It was 2 people who might not survive the year finding comfort where the war allowed. A hand squeezed too hard after a close call. A shared cigarette burned down to ash behind a warded door. A laugh in the dark that sounded like relief and grief at the same time. 2 bodies pressed close, because the alternative was lying alone with fear and listening to the world die. They were careful, not because they were ashamed, because secrets were survival. And then, In early 1979, Marlene discovered she was pregnant. The choice that echoes through history, the war was escalating. Voldemort wasn't just killing, he was hunting, and he was not hunting randomly. He targeted blood traitors, he targeted prominent fighters, he targeted symbols, and Sirius Black was a symbol in every direction at once. A Black who rejected his family, best friend of James Potter, inner circle order member, young enough to still be visible, bold enough to be unforgettable. Marlene's family was known order, sympathizers, Death Eaters were closing in, and the moment a child existed, that child became a weapon in waiting. They went to Dumbledore because there were very few people left who could see 10 moves ahead and still sleep at night. Dumbledore listened in the headmaster's office, surrounded by portraits that pretended not to eavesdrop, and a phoenix that watched everything like it, understood what humans refused to say. Marlene was 3 months pregnant. She could hide it in robes and charm work for a while, but concealment isn't permanence. Eventually, the body becomes honest. Sirius didn't sit. He paced, restless as a storm trapped in a room. When Dumbledore finally spoke, his voice was quiet in the way knives are quiet. The child must be hidden, he said, not only physically, not only behind wards, she must be made invisible in the deepest sense. If Voldemort learns Sirius Black has a daughter, he will use her against you, against the Order, against everything you love. He will bleed the world to find her. Where? Marlene asked. I know a couple, Dumbledore said. Muggles, kind people. They have tried for years to have a child, and cannot. Sirius stopped pacing like he'd hit a wall. Memory charms, he said flatly. You mean to change them? To rewrite their lives? I mean to save your daughter's life, Dumbledore corrected. And yours, and Marlene's, and everyone else Voldemort would torture to get to her. Sirius looked at Marlene, and for a second his mask cracked. Not fear for himself. Fear for the thing they'd made. Marlene's hand rested on her stomach, like she could shield the baby with skin alone. Then her jaw tightened. Do it, she said, whatever it takes to keep her safe. And in that moment, the war stole something else from them. Not just time, not just peace. It stole the right to keep their own child. September 19th, 1979. A birth and a lie. The girl was born on September 19th, 1979, in a private room at St. Mungo's. She was healthy, loud, furious in the way newborns are furious. As if she'd already decided the world owed her an explanation. She had a shock of dark hair and eyes that would eventually look like stormlight in the right shadow. She was extraordinary in the simplest way. She existed. Sirius held her for exactly 10 minutes. He counted. 1 minute, her breath on his skin. 2 minutes, her tiny fingers closing around his thumb. 3 minutes. Her weight, so small it felt like it could disappear. 4 minutes, the curve of her mouth when she cried. 5 minutes. Marlene watching him like she was trying to memorize this too. 6 minutes, a thought creeping in. I might never hold her again. 7 minutes, his throat burning. 8 minutes, him refusing to cry because crying felt like surrender. 9 minutes, him failing. 10 minutes, him kissing her forehead like that could protect her. She's perfect, Sirius whispered. She's ours, Marlene said. No matter what happens, no matter where she goes, she's ours. And then Dumbledore moved, not with spectacle, not with cruelty for its own sake, with the terrible calm of someone doing the least awful thing available. David and Helen Granger were both dentists, early 30s, intelligent, kind, completely ordinary. They were also desperate, quietly, with the kind of longing that makes you flinch at baby adverts and avoid family gatherings where people ask questions. Dumbledore selected them because they would love. because they would never suspect their joy had been built with spells. The memory charms were flawless, not a smear over the mind, but an entire history installed like it had always been there. Memories of a pregnancy, memories of a birth, memories of sleepless nights and first smiles, memories of their own hands shaking with love, photograph albums filled with pictures that had never been taken, medical records documenting appointments that had never happened, the absolute certainty that the child in their arms was theirs in every way that mattered. And they named her Hermione, Jean Granger, a name that would later become famous for courage and stubborn brilliance, a name that would later stand in direct defiance of blood ideology, a name that in this timeline was also a shield. Sirius watched them leave with his daughter, watched Helen Granger cradle the baby with the fierce protectiveness of a mother, watched David's hand rest on his wife's shoulder, steady and warm, watched them walk away into a world that would be Hermione's for 11 years. "It's done," Dumbledore said quietly. "She'll be safe, will she?" Sirius asked, and his voice sounded empty, scraped out, like a room after a fire. "Will she be safe when she grows up and doesn't understand what she is? Will she be safe when she comes to Hogwarts and everyone tells her she's Muggle-born, that her magic is stolen, that she doesn't belong? She will be safer than she would be with the name Black," Dumbledore said. "It may not feel like enough, but it will have to be." Sirius stared at the door long after they were gone, because he understood the exchange. His child would live, but she would live without him. 1981, the secret dies, or so it seems. Marlene McKinnon was murdered in mid-1981, brutal, methodical, a massacre designed to echo. Her entire family gone with her, as if Voldemort wanted the world to remember that blood traitors did not get endings. They got warnings. Sirius carried the grief alone. He couldn't mourn publicly. He couldn't break down at an order meeting and say her name like it belonged to him, because their relationship had been secret, because the moment people asked why it hurt so much, they might start digging, and digging was dangerous. He couldn't tell James. He couldn't tell anyone that he had a daughter, because the only thing keeping Hermione alive was the fact that no one knew she existed. 2 months later, October 31st, 1981, James and Lily Potter died. The betrayal didn't just kill them, it broke the shape of the future. And Sirius, already half drowned in grief, moved like a man with one thought: find Peter. Tear the truth out of him. Make it mean something. But Peter Pettigrew was clever in the worst way. He understood that panic makes people look guilty. He understood that explosions erase details. He understood that a missing finger can become a corpse if you sell the story hard enough. 12 muggles died in the street. Peter vanished. Sirius was found at the scene, laughing like madness had finally won. And Barty Crouch Sr., head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, sent Sirius Black to Azkaban without a trial. No evidence, no veritaserum, no pensive memories, no chance to speak, just a door that closed, just dementors that fed on everything good he had ever felt, just the slow rot of a man who was not only innocent, but also unable to say the single truth that might have changed how history treated him. Because if he said it, he would paint a target on his daughter. So he stayed silent, and the secret, in the eyes of the world, died with him. 12 years, 2 lives moving in opposite directions. For 12 years, Sirius Black rotted in Azkaban. Dementors do not just steal happiness. They strip you down to the bones of your worst memories and then make you live there until you forget what light feels like. And for 12 years, Hermione Granger grew up in a Muggle home, loved by parents who believed she was theirs, and in every way that mattered, treated her like she was. She did not grow up in a manor. She grew up in neat rooms and dental magazines and quiet evenings. She grew up being told she was clever, being praised for reading too much, being gently teased for correcting adults. She grew up with stability, and that stability was built on a lie so perfect that even love couldn't see it. The only person who knew the truth was Albus Dumbledore, and Dumbledore kept it, because he believed he had to. 1991. The magic manifests. Hermione's first accidental magic didn't arrive like thunder. It arrived like desire. A book she wanted on a high shelf floated down into her hands as if the world had decided to cooperate. The second time it happened, it was fear. A boy pushed her at school, and he flew backward as if struck by an invisible hand. By the time she was 9, the incidents were frequent enough that the Grangers became quietly, desperately worried. They were rational people. They looked for explanations in science, in psychology, in medicine. They wrote down dates, patterns, triggers. They tried to solve their daughter like a puzzle. They found nothing. Then, on her 11th birthday, the letter arrived. Not an email, not a phone call, not a government document. Parchment, ink, and the unmistakable weight of a world that did not care whether you believed in it. Professor McGonagall arrived to explain that their daughter was a witch. The Grangers felt relief and terror at once. Relief because their child wasn't ill. Terror because she was walking into a world they couldn't protect her from. Hermione felt only wonder. She devoured her textbooks like starving. She practiced wand movements from diagrams. She memorized the rules because she believed rules could make her safe. She boarded the Hogwarts Express on September 1st, 1991, convinced that knowledge and effort would be enough, that if she just studied hard enough, practiced enough, proved herself enough, she would belong. She had no idea that she already belonged in a way no one else at that school could claim. Because in this timeline, when the sorting hat touched her hair, it didn't only sense intelligence, it sensed legacy. It sensed something old and sharp beneath the surface. It sensed a magical signature that had been masked since infancy. And far away, behind Dementor cold walls, Sirius Black shivered. Not from cold, from something else. Strangest sensation, like a thread that had been slack for years, had finally pulled tight. Like somewhere in the world, something that was his had stepped into magic. The first thing Hermione Granger learned about Hogwarts was that the castle had moods. It wasn't simply old stone and moving staircases, not simply portraits that talked like gossiping relatives. The air itself felt alive. Sometimes it was warm with candlelight and bread smell drifting from the kitchens, and sometimes it was cold in a way that didn't come from winter. And in her first week, Hermione learned something else too. Hogwarts noticed her, not in the way teachers noticed an eager student, not in the way classmates noticed the girl who raised her hand too often, in a different way, in the way a lock recognizes the shape of a key that has been near it before. She didn't have words for it, so she did what she always did. She studied it. She watched patterns. She took mental notes. She tried to make the unknown behave like a problem that could be solved with enough reading and enough effort. But some things refused to become tidy. Some things felt like instincts. And instincts are not learned. They are remembered. The sorting and the first crack in the disguise. Hermione always told the story the same way when people asked. She'd sat on the stool. The hat had dropped over her eyes. It had whispered into her mind. It had considered Ravenclaw. And then, after a long pause that made her stomach tighten, it had shouted, Gryffindor. A bold choice, people said. Surprising for someone so bookish. But the truth, in this timeline, was stranger. The hat had felt her thoughts, yes. It had tasted her hunger for knowledge, her fear of being wrong, her frantic need to belong. And then it had felt something deeper, a signature, a shape in her magic that didn't resemble first-generation power, wild and untrained, and bright but scattered. It resembled something older, heavier, like a river that had been guided into the same channels for centuries. And for a moment, the hat had gone very still, not because it was confused, because it recognized her. Black, it had whispered, and the word wasn't an insult in its voice. It was a name spoken like a door opening. Hermione's heart had hammered. What? She'd thought, sharp and panicked. She didn't know why. She didn't even know what the word meant in this context. And then the hat had shifted, as if adjusting how it spoke to her mind. Not black. It had corrected, almost reluctantly. Hidden, masked. But there, you have Gryffindor in you, plenty of it. But you also have something else, something that could swallow you if you let it. And her fear, because fear always answered first, had risen like a wall. Please, she'd thought. Not Slytherin, not that. The hat had chuckled, but it wasn't amused. It was old. Not Slytherin, it had murmured. Not yet. Not now. You'd tear yourself apart trying to be what they expect from you if I put you there. And then, louder for everyone to hear, Gryffindor. The hall had applauded. Hermione had slid off the stool, dizzy with relief. She didn't know she'd just been sorted around a secret, because if the hat had spoken honestly, if it had said what it had truly sensed, half the teachers in the hall would have frozen. And one man, in particular, would have heard a name like a knife in his skull. Severus Snape. First year. The ease that makes people uncomfortable. Hermione didn't just do well in class. She did well too quickly. Ron Weasley struggled with pronunciation and confidence. Harry Potter struggled with the basic rules of a world he'd never been taught. And Hermione, who should have been struggling too, Hermione, who was supposed to be behind, because she'd grown up without spells in the air and floating candles in her childhood, moved through the first term like she'd been dropped into a language her bones already understood. It wasn't that she had read her books twice. Lots of students read. It was that when her wand moved, it moved with certainty. When Professor Flitwick explained Wingardium Leviosa, he did it with the gentle patience of a man who'd seen students fail this spell for years. Swish and flick. Concentration. Timing. Belief. Hermione raised her wand, and the feather rose smoothly, steady as if lifted by invisible hands that didn't tremble. It wasn't a wobble. It wasn't a lucky fluke. It was control. Flitwick blinked, then clapped so sharply that the sound echoed. "Excellent, Miss Granger," he said. And there was something almost wary under the praise, like he was complimenting a child who'd just picked up a sword and held it like a veteran. In potions, the discomfort became sharper, because potions was not like charms. Potions was exacting and cruel. It punished arrogance. It punished mistakes. It punished impatience. And yet, Hermione brewed a cure for boils in her first lesson, without a single error, while Neville Longbottom melted his cauldron and set half the table smoking. Snape drifted past her station, robes billowing like a storm cloud. He looked down at her potion. Perfect color, correct viscosity, steady heat. His eyes narrowed. Most teachers would have praised her. Snape did not praise. Snape leaned in slightly, as if scenting something. Then he moved on without a word. But Hermione felt it anyway. The way you feel someone's gaze on the back of your neck. Not annoyance. Attention. First year ended, as it always ended, with danger, with a troll, with a forbidden corridor, with 3 children risking their lives because adults were either too busy or too blind. And Hermione was brave in that danger, in a way that surprised even her. She told herself it was loyalty. She told herself It was simply the right thing to do. But there were moments, small flashes, where something inside her enjoyed it, enjoyed the problem, enjoyed the stakes, enjoyed the feeling of pushing power through her wand and making the world obey. And that enjoyment frightened her more than anything else, because it didn't feel like something she'd chosen. It felt like something she'd inherited. The first whispers of blood children talk. They talk in common rooms and corridors, and behind hands in the great hall. Muggle-born, some said like it was a diagnosis. Mudblood, others said like it was entertainment. Hermione hated it. It made her hot with humiliation and rage. It made her want to prove herself so completely that the word would become meaningless. And yet, even among the people who sneered, there were odd moments. A Slytherin boy with slick hair, watching her spell work and frowning like he couldn't reconcile what he saw with what he believed. A pure-blood girl whispering, "She doesn't cast like a Muggle-born, does she?" Hermione didn't know what that meant. Casting was casting. Magic was magic. But sometimes, especially when she was angry, she felt her spells come from somewhere colder than intellect. In second year, the chamber opens again. History repeats itself at Hogwarts, the way ghosts repeat their deaths. Second year brought whispers in the walls, petrified students, writing in blood. The Chamber of Secrets. The school turned on Hermione, the way frightened communities always turn on the people they can label. Muggle-borns were being attacked. The word mudblood became sharper, louder, more confident, as if the castle itself had given permission for cruelty. Hermione reacted the way she always reacted. She researched. She studied basilisk lore until her eyes burned. She traced the timeline of attacks. She built a theory from scattered evidence, like she was building a bridge over a chasm. And then, because she could not bear helplessness, she did something that should have been impossible. Polyjuice's potion. A newt-level potion. A recipe that took a month, required rare ingredients, required precision most adult witches couldn't manage. Hermione brewed it at 12 years old in a bathroom with stolen supplies and nothing but a library book and raw stubbornness. People would later say she was just brilliant, but brilliance doesn't explain the steadiness of her hands. It doesn't explain the instinctive sense of timing, the way she adjusted heat without hesitation, the way she reacted to changes in the mixture as if she'd seen them before. It was like watching someone play piano without having been taught, fingers moving into the right places, as if the music lived in the muscles, and in the end, she paid for that ambition, because she was petrified, frozen with her hands still clenched around the evidence. And when she woke again in the hospital wing, the first thing she saw was Harry and Ron's terrified faces. They hugged her like she'd been dead. She laughed and told them off for being dramatic, because that was easier than admitting she'd felt the basilisk's gaze like death brushing her cheek. And somewhere far away, in Azkaban, a man who didn't know she existed screamed in his sleep. Because even through Dementors, even through madness, some part of Sirius Black still carried the shape of his daughter in his blood. And the chamber, down in the earth, kept whispering. Third year, when the disguise starts to slip. Third year was the year fear walked openly through the castle. Sirius Black had escaped. The ministry plastered his face everywhere like a warning. Murderer, traitor, monster. Hermione saw the moving photograph on the Daily Prophet and felt something strange in her chest. Something she couldn't name because she had no reason to name it. She told herself it was curiosity. She told herself it was horror. She told herself it was nothing. But her heart had thudded in a way that felt uncomfortably personal. She watched his eyes in the photograph. Grey, wild, and for a fraction of a second, she had the irrational thought that she'd seen those eyes before. Not in a picture. In herself, in mirrors, in certain shadows, in the strange moments where her own reflection looked like it belonged to someone else. She dismissed it as nonsense. She always dismissed anything that didn't fit into logic. But something else began to happen that year. Quietly, subtly, like a charm fraying at the edges. Her hair became worse. It wasn't simply bushy. It was defiant. It fought every attempt to tame it like it had its own will. And her eyes, in certain lights, looked less brown than they used to. Sometimes, when sunlight hit them the wrong way, they flashed a colder shade that made her look older than 13. She didn't understand why, so she did what she always did. She tried to fix it. Slay Keezy's hair potion, charms, brushing, until her scalp hurt. Nothing truly worked, because the truth was not on the surface. The truth was underneath. When Dumbledore had placed Hermione with the Grangers, he hadn't only used memory charms, he had used an appearance charm too. Not a dramatic transformation, not a mask that could be washed away. A subtle shift laid on an infant, designed to grow with her. Brown instead of black, warm eyes instead of storm grey, softer angles instead of aristocratic sharpness. Enough to make her look like the Grangers. Enough to make the world accept what it wanted to accept. But glamour charms placed on babies are not eternal. They last as long as the magic that supports them remains stronger than the magic growing beneath. And Hermione's magic, year by year, was getting stronger. Strong enough to push back. Strong enough to remember. Snape notices. Severus Snape had hated Sirius Black since school, in a way that was not rational, not clean. Hatred like that becomes part of you. It grows roots. And in third year, when he watched Hermione in potions class, something in him went very still. It wasn't the bushy hair. It wasn't the constant hand-raising. It was the way she held her wand when she was angry. Controlled. Precise. Like a blade instead of a stick. It was the way she corrected him fearlessly, when she believed he was wrong. Not with arrogance, but with absolute conviction. As if she couldn't imagine a world where truth bent to authority. And Snape saw it. So briefly it almost wasn't conscious. The echo of Sirius Black's posture. The same stubborn tilt of chin. The same dangerous confidence wrapped in intelligence. Snape did not name it, but he watched her more carefully after that. Lupin, the map and a thread in the dark, Remus Lupin, teaching defense, watched Hermione in a different way. He watched her like a man who'd survived the First War and didn't trust coincidences. He watched her fight Boggarts and saw a fear that was not childish. Hermione's Boggart wasn't a monster. It was failure. And Lupin, who understood how people break, understood what that meant. It meant she would push herself until she snapped. It meant she would choose the hardest path if she thought it was the right one. It meant she had the same kind of stubborn bravery that had gotten Sirius Black into trouble his entire life. Lupin did not realize he was watching the child of his friend, but some part of him, deep down, felt a familiarity he couldn't place. Because blood does that sometimes. It calls to the people who loved where it came from. The night everything should have ended. Third year, as everyone knows, ended in the shrieking shack. Peter Pettigrew revealed as alive. Sirius revealed as innocent. A truth so sharp it made everyone bleed. In this timeline, the events still happened, but they felt different under the surface, because Hermione's identity was already unstable. When she saw Sirius in the shack, gaunt, wild-eyed, laughing like someone who'd been starved, her body reacted before her mind did. Her stomach dropped. Her breath caught, and she didn't know why. She hated herself for it, because she believed he was a murderer. But the reaction was not rational. It was recognition without memory. Sirius looked at her too, and, for a fraction of a second, he stopped. Just stopped, because her face, under the bad light and the frantic motion, reminded him of something he had not allowed himself to remember in 12 years. Marlene's cheekbones, his own eyes, though still disguised, the shape of her anger, and then the moment snapped shut, because the truth wasn't ready yet. The time-turner night that rewrites fate. They saved Sirius. They did it with Hermione's time-turner, with her relentless logic guiding them through minutes like stepping stones across a river. But here, something else happened too. A small, invisible fracture in the protection around her, because time-turners are not gentle magic. They tangle threads. They pull at enchantments. And when Hermione spun time backward that night, when she ran through moonlight with her heart pounding and her mind moving faster than anyone else's, the glamour charm on her skin shuddered like a curtain hit by wind. Not enough to fall, enough to weaken, enough to make the next trigger, the one waiting in the world, more devastating. The summer of 1993, the world tilts. Harry ran away from the Dursleys. The leaky cauldron became his temporary shelter under ministry supervision. The wizarding world buzzed with fear about Sirius Black. And Hermione, invited to stay in Diagon Alley for a few weeks, stepped deeper into the magical world than she ever had before. It was supposed to be a holiday, but holidays do not exist for people like Hermione. She studied the shops, the people, the politics. She listened to conversations in the leaky cauldron and felt the way adults stiffened when certain names were spoken. Black, Azkaban, traitor. And then came Gringotts. And Gringotts, unlike people, did not care what stories you told. It cared what was true. Gringotts smelled like metal and old magic. It didn't smell like wealth the way people imagined wealth smelled. It smelled like stone that had been underground for centuries, like ink that had never dried, like coins that had been touched by too many hands that were now dust. And the goblins themselves had a way of looking at witches and wizards that made every visitor feel, for a second, smaller, as if you were not a customer, so much as a temporary inconvenience allowed to breathe in their halls. Hermione had always respected rules, systems, procedures. She liked the idea that the world could be organized into things that made sense. But Gringotts was not a system designed for her comfort. It was a system designed to survive her. And in the summer of 1993, that mattered. Because 2 years earlier, someone had tried to break into the deepest vaults to steal the Philosopher's Stone, because goblins do not forgive embarrassment, because they respond to threat the way they respond to insult, by sharpening the knife. The bank had upgraded its security, and Hermione, without knowing it, was a walking security violation. The detection field, it began with something small. Harry had wanted company, a normal day, a trip to withdraw money for school supplies that didn't involve dementors or prophecies, or the ministry hovering like a vulture. Hermione agreed, because Diagon Alley still felt like wonder to her, and because spending time with Harry meant she didn't have to listen to adults in hushed tones discussing Sirius Black like he was a monster in the walls. August 18th, 1993. They stepped into Gringotts beneath chandeliers that threw cold light onto marble. They walked past the long line of witches and wizards, clutching keys and parchment and entitlement. They watched goblins scratch quills across ledgers, as if recording the sins of the world. And then they reached the cart platform, the deep descent, the part that felt like entering the throat of something alive. The goblin assigned to them didn't smile. Goblins rarely did. He opened the cart door with brisk efficiency and motioned them in. Harry climbed in first. Hermione followed. And as the cart rolled forward, as it passed through a shimmer in the air that looked like heat haze, but felt like ice water, Hermione felt it. A wash, cold and invisible and absolute, like a river pouring through her skin. It wasn't painful. It was worse. It was clean. It felt like something deciding, with perfect certainty, what was real and what wasn't. Hermione sucked in a breath. Harry, sitting opposite, blinked hard like he'd felt something too, though less intensely. The goblin's eyes flicked to Hermione for half a heartbeat, not surprised, not curious, just aware, as if he'd seen this kind of thing before and didn't consider it his business unless it affected the bank. The cart rattled along tracks, plunging deeper, torches blurred into streaks. The air grew damp, stone pressed in on all sides, and Hermione's skin tingled like static. Then Harry said it. "Hermione, your hair." Hermione's stomach dropped. "What?" she managed, though her voice came out thin. Harry was staring at her with a strange expression that was half confusion and half alarm. "It's darker," he said. "It was brown. I swear it was brown. And now it's black. Pure black. Not dark brown. Not lighting makes it look different. Black like ink. Black like a crow's wing, catching torchlight." Hermione's hands went cold. "No," she whispered automatically, "because denial is the first spell most people cast." She lifted a hand to her hair and felt it there, thick and heavy and unruly as always. But the strands sliding over her fingers felt different, like they belonged to someone else. She pulled her wand too fast, almost dropping it, and in the polished bronze of the cart's inner panel, she saw herself, and she didn't. Her eyes. Grey, not hazel. Not a bit lighter than usual. Storm grey. The color of a winter sea under cloud. Hermione stared at her own reflection, and for a moment her mind did something it had never done before. It froze, because her entire life her appearance had been an anchor. Proof. Certainty. She was Helen and David Granger's daughter. She looked like them enough for the world to accept it. And now, the world had stopped accepting it. And the worst part wasn't the change itself. It was the feeling that the change wasn't new. It was a return, like she'd been wearing a coat for 13 years and had only just realized it wasn't hers. Harry leaned forward, voice lowered. Are you using polyjuice?" Hermione snapped her head up. "Don't be ridiculous," she hissed, because the idea was absurd. Polyjuice doesn't last 13 minutes if you're bad at it, let alone 13 years. Harry swallowed. "Then what is it?" Hermione forced herself to breathe, because panic was useless, and she refused to be useless. She did what she always did. She started building theories. A glamour charm, long-term concealment magic, identity alteration. But who would do that? And why? The goblin didn't react, didn't comment. The cart continued its descent, as if a child's identity crisis was not relevant to vault security. And in Gringotts, that was the only thing that mattered. The first lie cracks in the open air. When they reached Harry's vault and retrieved his money, Hermione barely registered the gold. She watched the goblin more than she watched the coins, watched the way he handled the key, watched the way he regarded her, expression unreadable, as if he knew, as if Gringotts had known her longer than she'd known herself. On the way back up, the cold wash hit her again as they passed through the detection shimmer. It didn't change her further. It didn't need to. It had done its work. By the time they stepped out into diagonally sunlight, Hermione's hands were shaking. She tried to hide it by gripping her book bag straps too tightly. Harry kept glancing at her like he was afraid she might vanish. Hermione walked quickly back to the leaky cauldron, up the stairs, into her room. She locked the door. Then she stood in front of the mirror and stared. Black hair, grey eyes, sharper angles to her face, as if the softness had been sanded away. She looked like herself, and she didn't. She looked like someone who belonged to a family with portraits and tapestries and history carved into stone. She looked like someone who had no business being called Muggle-born. She stayed there for a long time, breathing slowly, trying to keep her thoughts from breaking into 1,000 pieces. And then she did what she always did when the world made no sense. She went looking for the rule book. Research like a lifeline, Hermione spent 3 hours in Flourish and Blots and the adjacent apothecary library corner, pulling volumes off shelves so fast the shopkeeper started watching her like she might steal them. Glamour enchantments and their degradation over time. Infant enchantment imprinting. Identity wards. Genealogical verification spells. The interaction between concealment magic and detection fields. She read until the words blurred. And the more she read, the clearer one thing became. Glamour charms placed early could be woven into the body's developing magic, growing with the child. But the moment the child's own magic became strong enough, the glamour became unstable. It didn't vanish gradually like dye fading. It snapped, especially when stripped by something like the thief's downfall or a detection field built on similar principles. Hermione closed the book, swallowed, and whispered to the empty air, "Someone hid me." And the idea felt like falling. Because if someone had hidden her, then someone had decided her life for her before she could speak. Someone had chosen her name, chosen her face, chosen her history. And the Grangers, kind, gentle, ordinary, had been used as pieces on a board without even knowing they were playing. Hermione's throat tightened until she couldn't swallow properly. She sat on the edge of her bed and pressed her hands to her eyes. Then she forced herself to stand, because collapsing didn't solve anything. And she did not collapse. Into the leaky cauldron, into the noise of wizards and witches laughing and talking, and drinking butterbeer, into the world that suddenly felt like it was tilting. And that's when the second part of the crack happened, because other people noticed. The Weasleys arrive, and Molly sees too much. August 25th, the Weasleys arrived at the leaky cauldron, red hair blazing like a warning sign in the dim pub light. Molly Weasley took one look at Hermione and stopped mid-sentence. "Oh, Hermione, dear," she began automatically, then trailed off, her eyes narrowed, not in suspicion. In recognition, Hermione's stomach turned. "What?" Hermione asked too sharply. Molly blinked like she'd forgotten where she was. "It's your hair," Molly said, voice soft. "It's darker." "I didn't dye it," Hermione said quickly. "It changed at Gringotts." Arthur Weasley, who was usually smiling, turned serious. "Changed how?" Hermione explained, as precisely as she could. "The detection shimmer, the cold wash, the mirror, the eyes." Arthur's face shifted the way a man's face shifts when he hears a word that rewrites a situation. "The detection field," he murmured. Gringotts expanded their enchantments. Hermione nodded. "It strips concealment magic." Arthur looked at her closely, not like a friend's father, like an investigator, like a man who understood bureaucracies and loopholes and the way powerful people hid things. And then he went, still Merlin's beard. He whispered. Molly's hand flew to her mouth. "What?" Ron demanded, looking between them. Harry's face was pale. "Who do I look like?" Hermione asked. And her voice was steady only because she was holding it there by force. Arthur didn't answer immediately, because the answer was dangerous, because names have power in the wizarding world, because the name in his mind was a name that made newspapers scream. But Molly answered anyway. "Like a black," she said quietly. The silence that followed was heavy enough to press on ribs. Ron frowned, confused. "Like Sirius Black?" he blurted, then looked horrified, as if he'd said something forbidden. Arthur nodded slowly. "The bone structure, the eyes. Now that the charms, Merlin, help us." Hermione's heart hammered That's impossible, she said, because she needed it to be. I'm Muggle-born. Molly's voice was very soft. Blood doesn't always announce itself honestly, love. Hermione stared at them. Arthur took a breath. My grandmother was Cedrilla Black before she married Septimus Weasley. He said, the family disowned her for marrying a blood traitor, but the blood connection exists. Molly's family, the Prewets, connect to the Blacks too, through Lucretia Black. Hermione's head spun. You're saying I could be related to you? Arthur shook his head. No, not like that. Not distantly, not by marriage, not by old tree tangles. You look like the main line. You look like, he swallowed, like Sirius. Hermione's hands clenched into fists. Then why was I hidden? She whispered. Why would anyone hide? To protect you, Molly said, and her eyes were wet. If you were born during the war, and if your parents knew Death Eaters were hunting, they might have done anything to keep you safe. But Sirius Black is in Azkaban, Hermione said, voice breaking. He's a murderer. Everyone says he betrayed Harry's parents. Arthur's gaze sharpened. Sirius never had a trial, he said carefully. Not a proper one. Hermione stared. What? Arthur looked grim. Barty Crouch authorized imprisonments without trial during the war. We accepted it because we were afraid, because we wanted villains to blame. I always thought Sirius was guilty because the story was too neat, but if you were hidden, if you were masked with infant glamour, he stopped, because the implication was enormous, because it suggested Sirius Black might not be what the Ministry said. It suggested Hermione's entire life might be built on a lie designed not to protect a criminal's child, but to protect an innocent man's daughter from becoming leverage. And Hermione, who had built her identity on being Muggle-born, felt the floor vanish under her. The decision to go to Grimmauld Place, Arthur was the one who said it, because Arthur Weasley was practical in the way kind people are practical. There's one place that will tell us, he said. One piece of magic that doesn't care about rumors. The Black family tapestry. Hermione's breath caught. That's in Sirius Black's house, isn't it? Molly's lips tightened. 12 Grimmauld Place. The house is sealed, cursed, full of old darkness. Arthur nodded. But the house magic recognizes blood, and if the tapestry is intact, it will show the truth. Hermione should have said no. She should have run back to her parents and clung to the normality she'd grown up with. But Hermione Granger did not run from truth. She ran toward it, even when it terrified her. August 28th, 1993. The door that wasn't there. They stood in a London street between two ordinary townhouses. Numbers 11 and 13. Neat and forgettable. Hermione stared. There's no 12, she said. Arthur nodded. That's the point. He lifted his wand and began a complicated sequence of charms. Words that felt older than English and twisted in the mouth like keys turning in locks. Harry watched, tense. Ron fidgeted. Molly looked like she was preparing for battle. And then, between 11 and 13, the world shifted. A new space unfolded like a breath held too long, finally released. A black door appeared where there had been brick, number 12. Grimmauld Place. Hermione's skin prickled. It felt like stepping into a place that didn't want her. Then Arthur touched the door, and the door opened. Dust billowed out like the house was exhaling after years of silence. The entrance hall was dark, thick with the smell of rot and old magic. Portraits lined the walls, their eyes following. The house was alive with resentment, and Hermione, despite everything, felt something else too. A pull, like the building recognized her, like it had been waiting. The screaming portrait and the taste of inheritance. They climbed the stairs, each step creaking like a complaint. They passed an umbrella stand that turned out to be made from a troll's leg. Ron gagged. They nudged a set of curtains, and a portrait behind them erupted into sound. A woman's face twisted with rage. "Filth! Blood traitors! Shame!" she shrieked. Hermione froze. Molly slammed the curtain shut, breathing hard. "Wahlburger Black," she muttered. "Sirius's mother." Hermione's stomach turned. "That woman is my—" She couldn't finish, because the word tasted wrong. Mother, grandmother, family. The drawing room and the tapestry. The drawing room was large, high-ceilinged, dominated by one massive wall hanging, the tapestry. Golden thread on dark fabric, names and lines branching like veins. 700 years of blood, recorded in embroidery like scripture. Hermione approached slowly. She read names she recognized from books and rumors. Black, Black, black marriages into other families, branches spreading into the sacred 28 like roots. Malfoy, Lestrange, Crouch, Flint, Burke, names that had always felt like politics to her, and now felt like danger. She traced the tree down to the most recent generation, and there it was. Sirius Orion Black III. His name was scorched, burned away from the tapestry by his mother in rage. But the magic had preserved the space where it had been, like a scar that refused to vanish. Below his name, there should have been nothing. No spouse, no children, a dead end. Hermione stared at the blank space, heart hammering. And then, as if the tapestry had heard her breathing, the golden thread began to move. It formed slowly at first, like ink bleeding into paper. A line extended downward from Sirius's name. Hermione's mouth went dry. The thread split, and a new name appeared in flowing gold script: Hermione Jean Black. The room tilted. Hermione's knees buckled. Ron caught her, swearing. Harry's breath made a strangled sound. Molly covered her mouth again, tears spilling. Arthur whispered, voice shaking. "Merlin?" The tapestry didn't stop. Beneath Hermione's name, in smaller script, another line appeared. Daughter of Marlene McKinnon. Hermione couldn't breathe. She stared at the words until they blurred. "It's true," she whispered. "It's actually true. The word caught in her throat like a stone. His daughter. Harry's hand gripped her shoulder. "Hermione," he said. Voice cracked because he understood what this meant in a way no one else could. Sirius Black wasn't just a name on a wanted poster. He was Harry's godfather. And if Hermione was Sirius's daughter, then she was Harry's family too. And somewhere deep down, something warm and fierce twisted in Harry's chest, because Harry Potter had spent his whole life starving for family. And now family had been sitting beside him in class for 3 years, correcting him and saving his life, and yelling at him for being reckless. Hermione's mind, however, did not go warm. It went cold, because the researcher in her didn't stop just because her life had exploded. She looked at the tapestry like it was evidence. "The glamour charm," she whispered. "Someone put it on me as a baby to make me look like the Grangers." Arthur nodded. "To hide you." Molly's voice was a trembling whisper. "To protect you." Hermione's hands clenched so hard her nails bit her palms. "From who?" she demanded. "From Voldemort? From Death Eaters? From the Ministry?" Molly flinched. Arthur swallowed. "From anyone who would use you." Hermione's throat tightened. "And my parents, the Grangers, they were enchanted," Molly said softly. "Not harmed, but rewritten." Hermione's eyes stung. She loved them. She loved them with her whole heart. They weren't her blood, but they were her home. And now she had to hold two truths at once. They were her parents, and they weren't. The heir of the House of Black, Arthur stared at the tapestry like it might bite him. Hermione, he said, very carefully, do you understand what this means? Hermione swallowed. It means, Sirius Black is my father, she said flatly. Arthur nodded. And it means, you are the heir of the noble and most ancient House of Black. The phrase sounded ridiculous coming out loud, like a title in a story, not something attached to a 13-year-old girl with ink-stained fingers. But the tapestry glowed with certainty. It wasn't just saying who she was, it was announcing her to the world. Hermione looked at the golden thread connecting her name to Sirius's burned space, and she felt something inside her shift. Something that had been dormant. Something that had been waiting, like a locked door in her chest clicking open. She didn't want power. She had spent her whole life fighting the idea that blood should matter. But power didn't ask what she wanted. Power arrived anyway. And the first thing she thought was not money, not status, not revenge. It was Azkaban. It was a man rotting behind dementors who had never even known she existed. It was the shape of injustice. I'm going to get him a trial, she said. Harry blinked. What? Hermione's voice sharpened like steel. If he's guilty, fine. Let the law prove it. But if he's innocent, if he never had a trial, she turned to Arthur. You said he never had one. Arthur nodded grimly. No formal trial, no due process. Hermione's eyes burned. Then the ministry broke its own laws, she said, and I'm going to force them to fix it. Molly exhaled shakily. Oh, love. Ron stared at her like she'd grown fangs. You can do that. Hermione looked back at the tapestry, at 7 centuries of names, at gold thread that represented influence and wealth and political weight. And she realized something that made her feel sick. She could. Because the wizarding world respected blood, whether it admitted it or not. And now she had the kind of blood the wizarding world bowed to. And she hated that. But she would use it. Because if blood was the language they understood, she would speak it until they choked on it. The first night, Hermione tried to sleep in Grimmauld Place. She failed. The house creaked like it was arguing with itself. Portraits muttered insults through the walls, as if the air carried family grudges like dust. Somewhere in the dark, pipes ticked and sighed, and every sound made her brain insist it meant something. But that wasn't why she couldn't sleep. She couldn't sleep because the tapestry had written her name into history with gold thread. And once your name is written, the world starts noticing you. She lay on an old bed with a scratchy blanket that smelled like mothballs and old anger, staring at the ceiling, replaying the words in her mind over and over until they stopped sounding like language and started sounding like a spell. Hermione Jean Black, daughter of Marlene McKinnon. And the deeper truth underneath it, the one that felt like a weight on her chest, Sirius Black never had a trial. Hermione had always believed in rules. Even when she broke them because she believed rules had a purpose. But what she learned in that moment was this: rules are only real if powerful people can't ignore them. And for 12 years, powerful people had ignored the most basic rule of justice. And her father had paid for it with his mind. She understood suddenly why her anger felt so sharp. It wasn't just outrage on principle. It was blood deep. It was the same kind of rage the Black family had always carried, except the Blacks had aimed it at the wrong targets. Hermione was going to aim it at the ministry. The library that feels like a weapon. Grimmauld Place had a library, not a school library with rules and Madame Pince's glare. A family library, the kind of library that existed because generations of Blacks had hoarded knowledge, the way they hoarded gold. Books stacked in dark shelves, spines cracked and worn, ink that smelled like old spells and older secrets. Hermione walked into it the next morning with a candle in one hand and her wand in the other, because she didn't trust the house not to bite. The shelves were dense with titles that made her skin prickle. Law, bloodline records, pure blood etiquette, dark artifacts, warding manuals written in archaic script, historical accounts of wizarding politics with margins full of bitter commentary. And for a moment, she felt sick. This was the heart of the ideology she'd spent 2 years fighting. This was the brain of the machine that called her Mudblood. And now it belonged to her. She stood there, listening to the crackle of candle flame, and made herself a promise. I will not become them. But she also made herself another promise, colder and more practical. I will use what they built, because if the world insisted blood mattered, then she would take their blood-stained tools and use them to carve something better. She pulled books off shelves until her arms ached. She sat on the floor with parchment spread around her like battlefield maps. Arthur Weasley came to help, because Arthur understood bureaucracy the way Hermione understood textbooks. Molly brought sandwiches and tea and watched Hermione with an expression that was part pride and part fear, because Molly Weasley knew what it meant to challenge powerful men. Harry sat nearby, quiet, too tense to speak much. Ron tried to joke, but his jokes came out thin, because the reality was heavy and he could feel it pressing down. And Hermione read, Wizarding law, she discovered, was written like a maze. The Wizengamot Charter of Rights was clear in principle, but laced with exceptions and loopholes, designed to give the ministry room to breathe and powerful families room to maneuver. It guaranteed the accused the right to trial, the right to present evidence, the right to call witnesses, and then it listed emergency provisions, and then it listed wartime authority powers, and then it listed ministerial discretion. It was built to sound noble, and built to bend. Hermione's jaw clenched as she read, because bending was how Sirius Black had ended up in Azkaban without anyone asking whether he deserved to be there. By the second day, she had a stack of citations and cross-references, and a legal outline that looked like a war plan. Arthur watched her with increasing alarm. You do realize you're 13, he said carefully. Hermione didn't look up. I do realize, she said, and the ministry is counting on that. The petition, making law into a blade. Hermione drafted the petition the way she drafted essays, with ruthless precision. She didn't write like a child begging adults to listen. She wrote like a citizen invoking rights. She opened with the charter. She cited the specific clauses. She referenced the lack of trial record. She emphasized that there was no veritaserum testimony on file, no pensive memory evidence entered, no formal witness statements taken under oath. She framed it as a simple legal question. Does the Wizengamot Charter of Rights apply to Sirius Orion Black 3? Because if it did, the ministry had violated it. And if it didn't, the ministry was admitting publicly that certain citizens could be stripped of rights entirely by executive decision. She attached a blood inheritance declaration because she hated herself for needing it. But she understood reality. The wizarding world was more willing to listen to heir of House Black than Muggle-born girl who read the law. And the thing that made her angriest was that she wasn't wrong. She kept writing anyway. Her handwriting became sharper as her anger sharpened. Her language became colder. She included an explicit request for veritaserum testimony at trial. She included a request for pensive memory review. She included a request for a formal review of Barty Crouch Sr.'s wartime authorizations. Arthur read the draft, then looked at her like she'd just conjured a storm inside a teacup. This is going to set fire to the ministry, he said softly. Hermione nodded. Good. The moment the story goes public, Hermione could have filed quietly. She could have slid the petition into the ministry system like a needle. and waited for it to pierce. But waiting was what they wanted. Waiting was how bureaucracies killed causes without ever having to say no. So she did what she'd learned from history. If you want power to move, you make it visible. She sent the petition to the ministry, and she sent a copy to Grangers, formally declaring her status as heir and requesting notarized confirmation of blood verification. And she sent a copy to the Daily Prophet, not as a plea, as a fact. The headline hit on September 15th, 1993. Heir of House Black discovered alive, demands trial for imprisoned father. The article read like a bomb. It detailed the identity verification at Gringotts, the Black family tapestry confirmation, the formal petition demanding a trial under the Charter of Rights, the implication that Sirius Black had been imprisoned illegally. There was a photograph. Hermione standing before the tapestry, black hair falling around her shoulders like a cloak, grey eyes too sharp for 13. The golden thread connecting her name to Sirius's burned scar of a name. The wizarding world stared at the page and felt history shift, because everyone knew the House of Black. Everyone knew what that name meant. And now the heir was not a pure-blood socialite, raised in silken ideology. The heir was Hermione Granger, the girl who'd been called Mudblood in corridors. And that contradiction was so violent, it made people react like animals. Some were fascinated, some were afraid, and some were furious. Malfoy reads the paper. Lucius Malfoy read the headline over breakfast at Malfoy Manor and went utterly still. The quiet in that room was the kind of quiet that meant violence was being considered. Narcissa Malfoy sat across from him, pale in morning light, her expression unreadable. "That's impossible," Lucius said flatly. Narcissa's eyes didn't leave the photograph. "The tapestry doesn't lie," she said quietly. Lucius's fingers crumpled the newspaper just slightly. "If the tapestry acknowledges her, she is what she claims to be, Sirius's daughter. My cousin's child, a Muggle-raised girl sorted into Gryffindor, who spends her days defending mudbloods, cannot be the heir of House Black," Lucius snapped. Narcissa's voice was calm. "And yet she is." Lucius's jaw tightened. "Then we challenge it. We demand additional proof. We force a public blood verification test. We undermine her authority." Narcissa looked up then, eyes cold. The goblins verified her already. Lucius's eyes narrowed. "Then we ensure the trial never happens. Because if Sirius is exonerated, he becomes Lord Black. And if he dies in Azkaban, she inherits everything. Either way, we lose." Narcissa didn't deny it, and in the silence that followed, the Malfoys made a decision not to destroy Hermione. Not yet. To suffocate her. To bury the petition in procedure and influence until it became a story people got tired of hearing. The ministry panics. Cornelius Fudge read the article and felt his political world wobble. Fudge liked stability. He liked comfort. He liked problems that could be solved by smiling at the right person. This was not that. If the ministry admitted Sirius Black had been imprisoned without trial, it didn't just damage one case, it opened a door. It allowed people to ask, who else was imprisoned illegally? What else did the ministry do during the war? How many lives were ruined because Barty Crouch and his allies decided fear was a substitute for evidence? And Fudge feared one thing more than Voldemort. He feared losing control. "Deny the petition," he said to his staff. "On what grounds?" someone asked. Fudge's hands shook. "Procedural. Sirius Black is a convicted murderer. The case is closed." Another staff member hesitated. "Minister, there was no trial. No conviction record." Fudge stared at him, eyes wild. "Exactly," he snapped, "which means there's no conviction to overturn. The case was handled under emergency provisions. That won't hold up, the staffer said, almost pleading. Then we stall. Fudge said, voice sharp. We bury it. We demand more proof. We require hearings and committees and reviews. We exhaust her. He said it like strategy, but it sounded like what it was. Fanatic. And Hermione, who had spent 2 years watching adults react to crisis by doing nothing, had already planned for this, because the difference now was that she wasn't just a student. She was a Black, and the Blacks had always understood how the ministry worked. Amelia Bones, and the file that shouldn't exist like this. Amelia Bones was not the kind of woman you could charm with headlines. She was 53, an auror who'd survived the First War, who'd watched good people die and bad people walk free. She believed in law the way some people believed in religion, and she was respected for it. When Hermione's petition reached her desk, Bones read it once, then again, then a third time, slower. Then she requested the case file on Sirius Black's arrest, and what she found made her feel something she hadn't felt in years, unease, because the file was thin. Too thin. No trial record, no witness testimony transcripts, no veritaserum logs, no pensive memory evidence, just a summary, just a narrative, just a conclusion, court at scene, laughter. Therefore, guilty, Bones stared at it and felt her jaw tighten. This is not how justice is supposed to work, she said softly to herself. And then, because she could not ignore what she'd seen, she sent an owl. Miss Black, please report to my office. September 20th, 1993. Hermione walks into the ministry as someone new. Hermione arrived at the ministry in formal robes, black with silver trim. She'd hated putting them on. The fabric felt like a declaration, and declarations attracted attention. But she understood symbolism. If the wizarding world insisted she was a Black, she would not hide from it anymore. She walked through the atrium with Arthur Weasley beside her, and people stared. Some whispered, some sneered, some looked confused, because their brains were trying to reconcile the image with the memory of a bushy-haired girl in Gryffindor robes. Hermione kept her chin up, not because she felt brave, because she refused to look small. Amelia Bones studied her across the desk, like she was assessing a weapon. You look like him, Bones said finally. Hermione's throat tightened. I'm told that's unfortunate, she said, because humor was her shield when emotion threatened to spill. Bones's mouth twitched. I knew Sirius Black before the war. You have his eyes. And then, quieter, I knew Marlene McKinnon too. Hermione swallowed. I never knew her. Bones nodded once. I'm sorry. Then she opened the file. Miss Black, she said, voice firm. The irregularities in this case are substantial. However, reopening a 12-year-old conviction of a high-profile prisoner is politically volatile. I'm not asking for politics, Hermione said sharply. I'm asking for law. Bones held her gaze. The minister will claim emergency provisions. The war ended October 31st, 1981. Hermione said immediately. My father was arrested 2 days later. Emergency provisions do not justify 12 years. Bones's eyes narrowed slightly. You've done your homework. I've read every relevant statute in the Black Library, Hermione said. Bones paused. Then, slowly, she closed the file. Miss Black, I will recommend to the Wisengamot that your petition be granted. Hermione's breath caught. Bones continued, voice steady. If Sirius Black is guilty, the trial will confirm it. If he is innocent, then an innocent man has been imprisoned for 12 years, and the ministry will answer for it. Hermione's hands trembled slightly. Thank you, she said, and meant it. Bones leaned forward. But understand this. Lucius Malfoy will resist. Cornelius Fudge will resist. There are people in power who benefited from the story that Sirius Black was guilty. You will be challenging them. Hermione's voice was calm, colder than she felt. I'm the heir of House Black. I have political capital, and I'm going to spend it. The hearing is set. The bureaucracy tried to stall her anyway. Letters arrived demanding additional verification, requests for more documents, attempts to bury the petition in committees. Hermione responded with sharper letters, with citations, with procedural counters. Every time the ministry tried to slow her, she used their own maze against them. And because Bones was pushing from inside, because Arthur was advising, because the public eye was on the story, the ministry couldn't kill it quietly. They could only fight it loudly. The Wizengamot scheduled a hearing for November 15th, 1993, to decide whether the trial would happen at all. And the moment the date became official, the wizarding world shifted again. Because a trial meant evidence, and evidence meant risk. And the people who had built their lives on Sirius Black being guilty began to feel their foundations tremble. November 15th, 1993, arrived like weather. Not dramatic at first glance, not thunderous, just a date on parchment. But in Wizarding Britain, dates could be weapons. Hermione woke early that morning in Grimmauld Place, dressed in silence, and felt the house watching her. The portraits muttered behind curtains. The floorboards creaked under her feet like warnings. The air smelled faintly of smoke that wasn't there, like the house remembered every argument that had ever happened inside it and refused to forget. Hermione had slept badly for weeks, not because she feared losing, because she feared winning, because winning meant forcing the wizarding world to see her not as Hermione Granger, but as Hermione Black. And every time she put on black robes, every time she saw her name on official documents, she felt a pressure in her chest that wasn't pride, it was grief. For the life she'd lived as a girl who believed she belonged nowhere. For the parents who loved her without knowing why. For the identity she'd built from scratch, only to discover someone else had carved half of it for her before she could speak. But grief wasn't going to get Sirius out of Azkaban, so she walked to the ministry with Arthur beside her. And she kept walking even when people stared. The Wizengamot chamber was circular, tiered, and designed to intimidate. It wasn't like a courtroom with straight lines and predictable angles. It was like a coliseum. Plum-robed witches and wizards sat in rows that rose like steps, looking down at the center floor where the chair waited. The chair with chains, the accused chair. Empty, for now. Hermione stood in the petitioners' area and looked up at the faces. Some were old, pure-blood families who had ruled wizarding politics for centuries. Some were ministry loyalists. Some were quietly reformist members who had grown tired of fear, pretending to be justice. And then, in the minister's seat, Cornelius Fudge sat rigid, his expression fixed in the strained smile of a man trying to pretend he was calm, while his hands shook under the table. Dumbledore sat as chief warlock, eyes calm behind half-moon spectacles. Hermione felt his gaze on her occasionally like a weight and a question. And in the public gallery, Harry Potter sat pale and tense, hands clenched on the railing, because this was not just Hermione's petition. This was Harry's godfather. The hearing begins. Fudge called the session to order. We are here, he said, voice too loud, to consider the petition of Hermione, Jean Black, regarding the case of Sirius Orion Black, the I3. Hermione's heart hammered at hearing her name spoken in that room. It sounded wrong, too heavy. Miss Black, Fudge said, you may present your petition. Hermione stood. She had rehearsed, but rehearsal didn't matter when your body was full of adrenaline. She forced her voice steady. Honored members of the Wizengamot, I petition for a trial for Sirius Orion Black I3, under the authority of the Wizengamot Charter of Rights, which guarantees every accused witch or wizard the right to trial, the right to present evidence, and the right to call witnesses. Sirius Black received none of these rights. He was imprisoned without trial on November 2nd, 1981, and has remained in Azkaban for 12 years without due process. Fudge leaned forward quickly, eager. Wartime emergency provisions. The war ended October 31st, 1981. Hermione cut in instantly. And the fact that she interrupted the Minister of Magic in the Wizengamot chamber made several members inhale sharply. My father was arrested 2 days later. Emergency provisions cannot justify 12 years. A witch in the second row spoke sharply. Black was found at the scene of a mass murder. Pettigrew, dead. 12 muggles dead. Black, laughing. The evidence was overwhelming. Hermione turned towards the speaker. Was the evidence examined under veritaserum, she asked. Were pensive memories collected and entered? Were witnesses questioned under oath? No, because there was no trial. The chamber stirred, voices rising like wind. Fudge's mouth tightened. The circumstances spoke for themselves. Circumstances are why trials exist, Hermione replied, and her voice sharpened. I am not asking you to declare my father innocent today. I am asking you to do your job, to examine evidence that was never examined, to hear testimony that was never heard, and to provide the trial that was never held. If he is guilty, the trial will confirm it. But if you refuse a trial, you are admitting the ministry's handling of this case cannot survive legal scrutiny. The argument erupts. The chamber erupted into debate. Reformists argued the charter was clear, that denying a trial to any citizen was indefensible. Traditionalists argued reopening the case would undermine confidence in the ministry, destabilize society, reopen old wounds. Hermione listened, jaw clenched. She saw it clearly now. Half of them weren't talking about law. They were talking about comfort. They didn't want truth if truth meant admitting they had been wrong. Dumbledore raised a hand, and the room quieted reluctantly. The question before us is simple, he said, calm and deadly. Does the Charter of Rights apply to Sirius Orion Black 13? If yes, he is entitled to a trial. If no, then we must explain why the protections we guarantee to every other citizen do not apply to a member of the noble and most ancient House of Black. The vote was called. 31 in favor, 19 opposed. The trial was scheduled for December 10th, 1993. Hermione sat down slowly, hands shaking. She had won, and winning felt like standing at the edge of something enormous and realizing you had no choice but to jump. The month between, building the case while the world circles, the weeks that followed were brutal. The Daily Prophet ran stories every other day. Some praised Hermione as a brave heir seeking justice. Some framed her as a manipulated child used by Dumbledore. Some hinted she was an imposter. Some, carefully worded, suggested Sirius Black's daughter might share his dangerous instability. Lucius Malfoy pushed editorials without attaching his name. Fudge's allies whispered about protecting the public from reopened wounds. Certain Wizengamot members received mysterious gifts and sudden policy concerns. And at Hogwarts, the social world shifted. People who'd called Hermione mudblood now tried to smile at her. People who'd ignored her now watched her with calculating eyes. Draco Malfoy stopped mid-insult in potions class one day, mouth hanging open as if he'd stepped into the wrong reality. Hermione didn't react. She was too busy, because legal arguments were not enough. She needed facts. She needed proof. And proof was thin because the ministry had never built a real case in the first place. Hermione spent nights in Grimmauld Place Library, reading until dawn, then attending classes like sleep was optional. Harry tried to help, but his help was mostly emotional. Ron tried too, but Ron's help came wrapped in discomfort, because every new newspaper headline reminded him that Hermione's name carried power now. And through all of it, Hermione felt one terrible pressure. If the trial failed, Sirius would rot forever, and she would have exposed herself for nothing. The breakthrough, Remus Lupin. The breakthrough came from someone Hermione hadn't fully trusted. Remus Lupin requested a meeting on November the 20th. They met in his office, the room smelling faintly of chocolate and old parchment. Lupin looked tired. Not teacher tired. War tired. "I knew your mother," he said quietly. Marlene McKinnon. Hermione's throat tightened. "She was brilliant and brave," Lupin continued, "and she died far too young. I'm sorry you never knew her." "Thank you," Hermione said carefully, but she didn't let herself soften. Grief could wait. "I don't think you asked me here to talk about her." Lupin nodded. "No. I asked you here because I know something about Sirius that might help his defense. Something I should have questioned 12 years ago, but didn't because I was grieving and broken and too ready to believe the worst." Hermione leaned forward. "What?" Lupin swallowed. Sirius wasn't the Potter's secret keeper. Hermione's mind snapped into focus. "Explain." "James told me," Lupin said. "The last time I saw him, they switched. They made Peter the secret keeper, because no one would suspect him. Sirius was the decoy." Hermione's breath came fast. "Can you testify to that?" "Under veritaserum, if needed," Lupin said. "But there's a problem. Even if I testify, it doesn't prove Peter is alive. And if Peter is dead, then Sirius could still have killed him afterward." Hermione's eyes burned. "Peter isn't dead." Lupin stared. "What?" Hermione didn't hesitate. "He's been living as Ron Weasley's pet rat for 12 years. Scabbers." Lupin's face went blank with shock. "That's impossible. Ron's rat is 12 years old," Hermione said, voice sharp. "Rats don't live that long. He's missing a toe, which matches Peter's missing finger. The only remains found were a finger. And Peter was an unregistered animagus. We figured it out last June." Lupin's hands trembled. "Where is he?" "Ron still has him," Hermione said. "We've been watching him, making sure he doesn't escape." Lupin closed his eyes briefly like he might be sick. Then he opened them again. "We'll need an animagus reversal charm. I can cast it." Hermione nodded fast. "Then we have proof. Testimony that Peter was secret keeper. Physical proof that he is alive. And veritaserum on both Peter and Sirius. It will be undeniable." Lupin's voice cracked. "If Sirius is innocent," Hermione's jaw set, "then the people who put him in Azkaban will answer for it." December 10th, 1993. The trial, the Wizengamot chamber, was packed. Reporters crowded the press benches. Spectators filled the public gallery. Wizengamot members sat stiff with anticipation, some eager, some afraid. And then the doors opened. Sirius Black was brought in under heavy guard. He looked like a ghost of an aristocrat. Gaunt, hollow-eyed, his cheekbones sharp as blades, his hair tangled but still unmistakably black, his skin pale with the sickly tint of Dementor years. But when his eyes lifted and found Hermione, something broke across his face. For a moment, he wasn't a prisoner. He wasn't a rumor. He wasn't a villain painted in ink. He was a father, seeing a child he had held for 10 minutes. He stared at her like she might vanish if he blinked. And then, quietly, tears slid down his face. "State your name for the record," Dumbledore said gently. Sirius's voice came out rough, unused. "Sirius Orion Black IIEI. You stand accused of betraying James and Lily Potter, leading to their murders." said Amelia Bones, who had been appointed lead examiner. The murder of Peter Pettigrew and the murder of 12 muggles. How do you plead? Sirius swallowed. Not guilty. Bones leaned forward. The accused requests veritaserum testimony? Hermione stood. Yes, she said. Under the Charter of Rights, this request cannot be denied. Bones nodded once. Then she raised the small vial. 3 drops. Sirius didn't flinch. Bones dripped it onto his tongue. His eyes glazed slightly as the potion took hold. Were you the Potter's secret keeper? Bones asked. No, Sirius said immediately. We switched. Peter was secret keeper. I was the decoy. The chamber exploded in noise. Dumbledore slammed his staff once, and silence returned in jagged fragments. Did you betray James and Lily Potter to Voldemort? Bones asked. Never, Sirius said, and the word came out like a roar. James was my brother. I would have died for him. Did you kill Peter Pettigrew? No. Peter killed those muggles and faked his death, cut off his own finger, and transformed. He framed me. Where is Peter Pettigrew now? Bones demanded. Sirius's expression twisted with helpless fury. I don't know. I've been in Azkaban for 12 years, but he's alive. Hermione stood again. I can answer that, she said. Peter Pettigrew has been living as my friend Ronald Weasley's pet rat for 12 years. I have him here, and I have a witness who can force his transformation. Ron stepped forward, face white, carrying a small cage inside. A rat trembled violently. Lupin stood. Permission to perform the reversal charm. Dumbledore's voice was firm. Granted. Lupin raised his wand. The rat tried to bolt, but Ron slammed the cage shut too late, because Lupin's spell hit like a net. The air snapped, and where the rat had been, a man appeared. Small, balding, grey-skinned, with watery eyes and a missing finger. Peter Pettigrew blinked in torchlight, like he'd been dragged out of a nightmare. The chamber erupted into chaos. Bones's voice cut through it like steel. Peter Pettigrew, you are under arrest for the betrayal of James and Lily Potter, the murder of 12 muggles, and conspiracy to frame an innocent man. Peter tried to run. Aurours stunned him. Before he took 3 steps, veritaserum on Pettigrew was quick. Devastating. Under Truth Potion, he confessed to everything. The betrayal, the staged explosion, the finger, the rat life, the frame job. Every word hammered nails into the coffin of the story Wizarding Britain had lived with for 12 years. When it was done, Dumbledore rose. The Wizengamot will vote. All in favor of full exoneration of Sirius Black Theai. Hands rose. Not half. Not most. All unanimous. Dumbledore's voice softened. Sirius Black, you are hereby exonerated of all charges. The Wizengamot acknowledges the miscarriage of justice you have suffered. You are free. The chains released. Sirius stood slowly, swaying, as if his body didn't trust freedom. And then Hermione ran. She crossed the chamber faster than anyone could stop her. She collided with him, arms wrapping around his waist, face pressed into his robes. Sirius held her like she was real, like she was the only solid thing left in a world that had been made of nightmares. I'm sorry, he whispered into her hair. I'm so sorry, Hermione's voice cracked. I've got you now, she whispered back. We've got each other. And for the first time in 13 years, Sirius Black wasn't alone. The steps of the Ministry and the beginning of a new war. Outside the Ministry, the press waited like vultures. Photographers shouted. Reporters pushed questions like knives. How does it feel to be exonerated? Who will pay for the injustice? Will you seek revenge? Sirius froze, overwhelmed, blinking like the light hurt. Hermione stepped forward. My father will make a statement after he has recovered from 12 years of wrongful imprisonment, she said, voice carrying. The noble and most ancient house of Black thanks the Wizengamot for upholding justice. No further questions. She took Sirius's arm and guided him away, while Arthur and Lupin flanked them, and they disappeared into apparition before the crowd could swallow them. Home, and the decision to remake meaning, they arrived at Grimmauld Place. The house felt different with Sirius standing inside it. Not warmer. Not yet. But awake. Sirius looked around the entrance hall, like he was staring at a childhood scar. I never wanted to come back here, he said quietly. We don't have to stay, Hermione said. We can live anywhere. We have resources. Sirius shook his head slowly. No, this is the House of Black. For 7 centuries, this house stood for blood purity and cruelty, and everything wrong with our world. If we leave it to rot, it stays what it was. If we stay, we can change what it means. Hermione stared at him, and something fierce steadied inside her. Then we stay, she said. We remake it. We remake the name. And as she spoke, the house creaked softly, like it was listening. The exoneration detonated wizarding politics. The Daily Prophet ran a week-long series on ministry abuses during the war. Barty Crouch Sr. was disgraced. He resigned under health reasons that fooled no one. Fudge scrambled to survive, suddenly supporting reforms he'd tried to bury. Amelia Bones rose in influence, her reputation burning bright. And Pure Blood Society, so certain of itself, stared at a contradiction it couldn't digest. House Black had returned, led by a lord who was a known blood traitor, and an heir who had been raised as a Muggle-born. It should have been social death. Instead, it became something else, a signal. Families that had been quiet about their discomfort with blood purity began to lean toward the new House Black. They sent letters, congratulations, cautious invitations. Because if the oldest family in Britain could stand for justice instead of supremacy, then supremacy was revealed as what it had always been, a choice. And choices could be changed.